is that the whole story, the whole narrative of advocating for yourself on the basis of your identity historically has been because by law, you weren't allowed to be an individual. By the Constitution, you were 3/5 of a person. By Jim Crow laws, you couldn't ride the same train.
All right, sorry, I gotta pause it again. Let's talk about this ridiculous talking point that this leftist lady just made here about, well, according to the Constitution, you are 3/5 of a person, and therefore racism in America. This is just, it's just such a profound ignorance and lack of historical context. So let's just do a quick little lesson here for the 3/5 compromise. So the 3/5 compromise was something that emerged during the Constitutional Convention of 1787, right? This is when the founding fathers were convening in order to determine what the supreme document, in this case being the Constitution, right, would the supreme document and law of the land would be, okay? And what the 3/5 compromise what it did was it gave, in terms of representation for southern states, aka the states where slavery was legal and the states where slaves were owned and used, they could for every 5 black people they tried to count for purposes of legislative representation and taxation, okay, only 3 of them would be counted. So what this means is the 3/5 compromise actually hurt the South, which was what had slavery. It hurt them.
I'm convinced some people simply do not apply critical thinking to information they're consuming. Some people just want to believe what they want to believe. There isn't an evaluation of what a person is saying, rather who's saying it and if they hold the position the listener currently holds. Case in point, this host's assertion that the 3/5 compromise hurt the southern states, even after he said they wanted slaves counted for the purpose of representation and taxation. Now, 3 main items were up for grabs for this count. This is what made it so important. What was up for grabs were the number of seats in the House of Representatives, the number of electoral votes each state would be allocated, and the amount of taxes the state would pay. Those 3 items were determined by state population. The higher the population, the more you get of the 3. So since slaves were in the South, the southern states wanted to count all their slave population, even though the slaves had no rights to count towards the 3 items. The northern states didn't have slaves and were against this practice because they would be outnumbered. They argued to only count the people who had rights. But they compromised, and they compromised to count the slave population as 3 people for every 5 slaves. So how exactly did this hurt the southern states? They effectively were able to gain political power by including people who had no political power. That sounds like a win. They increased their representation in the House of Representatives. More representatives means more influence in legislative decisions. This isn't hard to understand. The representation in the House of Representatives also affected the number of electors each state had for the Electoral College. The 3/5 compromise increased the southern states' power in presidential elections. Again, easy to comprehend. The only downside, because of the population, they owed more in federal taxes. So, less taxes or more political power? Which one do I want? Let me think. Not a hard selection.
Okay, they wanted to count all the slaves for the purposes of representation, while the slaves had 0 political power practically whatsoever. Okay, so when this lady here is sitting here saying, well, the Constitution said 3/5 of black people or 3/5 of a person is such a racist. I mean, first of all, this was hundreds of years ago. But that aside, the 3/5 compromise was actually didn't help the South. It was not to their benefit, to the benefit of the southern states. So just wanted to clear the air real quick. Also, a quick fun little tidbit. Many of the founding fathers, a significant portion of them, were against slavery. People don't talk about this because they just want to push the narrative of, oh, the founding fathers, evil old white men, they own slaves, whatever.
So according to the host, many of the founding fathers, a significant portion of them, as he said, were against slavery. When he says founding fathers, I assume he means the men who founded the Constitution, which was the law of the land. If only they were in a position to do something about something they didn't want. For me, but maybe I think differently, if there was something that I didn't want in a document I was drafting, I don't know, I would leave it out. I mean, the only reason I would put it in is if I wanted it in. I learned this a long time ago. If a person's words and actions don't match, ignore what they say and watch what they do. That's a good way to see what they really want. The founding fathers may have said they were against slavery, but it wound up being the law of the land based on the document they drew up, adopted, and signed. It's kind of hard to say they wanted something different if they were the ones who put it in there.
Many of them were against it. Thomas Jefferson was famously against slavery, and he tried to even feature that within the founding documents, and unfortunately got shot down. But I mean, look what it led to. Eventually it was abolished, and that was the goal of many founding fathers who helped establish this nation in the first place.
So the goal, according to you, was to have slavery so it can later be abolished? That sounds counterproductive.
So, another quick fun little history bit I want to add.
Well, the last little bit of history you wanted to add was wrong, so let's see where you go with this one.
Did you know that the first legally recognized slave owner in the U.S. was, drumroll please, a black man? Yes. Not even kidding. They want to make this narrative, oh, it's the evil racist white people. Oh, like this lady says, the minorities, oh, us minorities, we're so oppressed. The first legally recognized slave owner was a black man. Look him up. His name was Anthony Jackson. All right, let's keep going.
Let's not keep going. I've heard this talking point a million times. I've heard it enough to know that the guy's name on this talking point is Anthony Johnson, not Anthony Jackson. It's interesting, every time I've heard this talking point, the idiot saying it says that this happened in the U.S. or in America. Well, listen to this idiot say the same thing.
Who was the first legal slave owner in slavery history in this country? Who was the first legal slave owner? Does anybody know his name? Nobody know his name? Anthony Johnson. Have you ever heard of Anthony Johnson? What color do you think Anthony Johnson is? He's black. Go look it up. Don't believe me. I know some people. Raise your hand if you think I'm lying. Raise your hand. I'm not gonna get hurt. My feelings are gonna get hurt. Anthony Johnson, first legal slave owner in our history of slavery in this country.
Obviously, it wasn't in America or the U.S. because the country hadn't been established yet. I'm assuming they looked this up and saw the date, just like I'm doing. I'm assuming they know the date of the foundation of America, just like I'm showing. So why is it so important to put these two together? It's because they want to say slavery wasn't a racial thing. Because not only did black people do it too, blacks were the first ones to do it in the U.S., according to them. We know the U.S. portion that they say is a lie and added to their talking point for effect, but the principle behind this shouldn't be who was allowed to own slaves, rather who was allowed to be slaves. In the actual U.S., after it was founded and governed by the Constitution, blacks were the only people designated for chattel slavery. That's a fact they desperately tried to avoid. So I urge people, use critical thinking in evaluating what these idiots say, because if you don't, you'll become the idiot. And nobody needs that.